Welcome to the Joe Schmo Show and my special podcast in response to the Ben Shapiro Gavin Newsom interview that was done on Gavin Newsom's podcast. I will link to the podcast in the description, and I'm going to separate this out into, I believe, 8 different parts. Each one is going to be a separate video. That way, it's a little bit easier for you to digest it in parts if you want to. And then I'll post all of them together in one video if you decide to watch them straight through. The first point I'd like to make is something that I think Ben Shapiro makes a good point about when he's talking about how politicians often say things to gain attention, and they don't care so much about the truth. I think it's really important to recognize this. And I think most people suggest, at least, that they do, and that, oh, I don't trust just this source or just that source or just this politician or whatever. But subconsciously, if someone is on your side or you're on their side, however you want to look at it, and they say something that you generally agree with, you're more likely to believe that and go with it without necessarily looking into whether that's true. I'll give you a good example of this, how this goes 2 different ways, right? Um, for example, there are some out there that are claiming ICE is acting like the Gestapo. And this is directly um, paralleling comments that Governor Tim Walz used in I believe, a spring commencement address. I don't know where it was, and I don't really care, and I don't really care about Tim Walz at all, insofar as um, his political future. He has none. Okay, but he made this claim that ICE is acting like the Gestapo, which I believe is a despicable, disgusting claim to make, both as an offense against the memory of those who were subject to the actual Gestapo and to the ICE agents who are just doing their job, right? But some people are using that, going with it, and without even thinking. It inspires them emotionally, and they don't regard the facts. On the other side of things, let's take Kristi Noem talking about saying that that Renee Good, the woman who was shot dead by an ICE officer after she rammed into him with her vehicle, um, that was an act of domestic terrorism. Now, some people are just going with it. Now, I personally, I'm neutral on the subject because I don't know about the intent. I don't know if the intent was there to harm this ICE officer agent, but even if there was the intent to do so, does that rise to the level of domestic terrorism? Frankly, there are a lot of examples of domestic terrorism, including acts against ICE, that are clear acts of domestic terrorism, like specifically targeting them. This one individual some months back who specifically targeted an ICE vehicle and shot up the vehicle and actually killed accidentally, obviously, a couple of illegal immigrants in the process. I believe he killed one and wounded another, and that is an obvious act of terrorism. Okay, in this case, I don't necessarily think that's there. Uh, so, great example of just hopping onto the bandwagon, as it were, one side or the other. You have to look at uh, the substantive facts about what is being discussed before you make up your mind, or at least that's how you should. I know it's not always the case. I know sometimes the issues are above one's understanding, as is often the case when it comes to issues I might talk about. I try to do my best to understand the issue before I come to a conclusion on it. I'll give you an example of one area I'm not great with: economics. Okay, economics is a very deep and uh, uh, complex subject matter that I don't fully understand. I have my general opinions about economics and how the government should stay out of the private sector as much as they can, and that some regulations are good, but overburdensome regulations hurt business. And these are basic general facts that uh, you know, when talking about specific instances, may or may not be as true as the general circumstance. Taking, for example, environmental regulations. Sometimes those environmental regulations are good, but a lot of the times they can be overburdensome. But in any case, knowing to your capacity, to your ability to understand an issue is important. And acknowledging when you don't know all of the facts to make an opinion, and to acknowledge that, at least to yourself, certain elements, certain voices uh, are particularly relevant to you, particularly influential. I uh, Personal example: I love Ben Shapiro. I love Mark Levin. Actually, I like Mark Levin a little bit better than Ben Shapiro when it comes to radio or podcasting, right? But I recognize that, well, first of all, I have disagreements with both. I disagree with Ben Shapiro, particularly when it comes to, let's say, Trump's tariffs. I think the tariffs are generally good, have generally um, been positive, or come to a positive conclusion for various, purposes. And Ben Shapiro's of the mind that tariffs are just a generally terrible idea. I disagree with him on that. I'm not above having disagreements with people I generally agree with. Um, I would say, as an anecdote, that Mark Levin, if you've ever heard of him, if you haven't heard of him, check him out. He's great. He can be a little bit antagonistic, shall we say? But I think overall he's of a great mind, and I would definitely suggest checking out his podcast, his radio show. It's on Spotify. Just look up Mark Levin Show. But in any case, I think that one of the biggest problems we have in our society right now is just this ignorance of uh, you know basic facts. Okay, so for example, when you argue about, when you discuss the shooting of Renee Good by ICE, and people are claiming the ICE officer wasn't hit. Well, I mean, you can look at least two of the three angles where he definitely clearly was hit. The bystander video doesn't really show much other than the direction of the wheels at the time the shot was fired. You can't really see the ICE agent because he's behind another ICE agent with his hand in the vehicle. And personally, when I first saw that video, I thought it was the ICE officer with his hand in the vehicle that was the one that took the shot, which is not true. It took me a couple of times from that angle, to even see, oh, there's another ICE agent directly in front of the car as it's moving. And even later did I even look at the wheels, and the wheels clearly are spinning on ice. Uh, no pun intended, actual H2O ice. Before it speeds off. And at the moment that is happening, those wheels are pretty much straight, if not turned a little bit towards the ICE agent. And only afterwards, approximately at the same time the shooting actually happens, do the wheels shift to the right. And then you have this other angle from some distance where it has to be zoomed in, but you can clearly see this ICE agent moving. So these are substantive facts that you can see through the video that change the perception. And you have to be open to that, because there's a lot of people out there that are still saying he wasn't hit by the vehicle, and it's very clear that he was. So, I don't despise the people that genuinely believe something that is wrong as much as I despise those who have a voice, who are saying things that either they're just plain ignorant of, and they shouldn't, they should acknowledge that at least before they spout off their opinion, or who pass off what they know to be false as the actual truth because they think it'll gin up, support for their side of the issue. And generally, you see a lot of politicians doing that. And that was one of Ben Shapiro's general points, was that politicians have a vested interest in ginning up support for them or for their side of things, without any regard to the facts. And it does go both ways. So you have to be careful whether you're on the right or the left or the so called middle, which I don't think really exists, but that's beside the point. So, as far as that is concerned, it's just a general philosophical approach whenever you're in this free media environment, this free speech environment, is like a lot of people, including Trump, exaggerate. Trump does a great deal of exaggeration. I don't necessarily think he lies so much, but he exaggerates quite a bit. Um, it, Exaggeration or lying, and yes, sometimes it's very difficult to wade through that and decide what is a lie, what is just an exaggeration, what is the truth. And when you're talking about what a politician is saying or what someone with a vested interest is saying, take that under consideration and perhaps with a grain of salt, because we don't you don't really get the truth, unfortunately, from people who have these vested interests. And that's to be said about politicians, about social media figures, but it's also to say about these social uh, social um, social science studies and research, and it goes even in that direction too. If someone has a financial interest in in a particular point of view, let's say they're funded by some organization that does a lot of work in some sort of social science area, something that has to do with the social policy, for example, whatever it might be, and they're paid to do a study, and that study is going sometimes, and unfortunately so, to be skewed to make the point that whoever is funding them is trying to make. Okay, so that that organization can use this so-called scientific study to promote their own perspective. It is something you have to look out for beyond politics, but also in this in perhaps an academic field of interest as well. There's a lot of that crap out there. When I was studying my course of study, political science, there was a great deal of you know annoyance on my part having to look at journal articles and read through these and say, okay, this just doesn't add up. You clearly have an agenda here, or there are some facts that are clearly missing here. And it was generally frustrating because you're supposed to rely on these. A lot of professors want you to rely on these, and they're generally, not generally not truthful, but oftentimes there is quite a deal of bias, and you have to look at so much information to get through to the basic facts. And this also tends towards the discussion about objective versus subjective notions of truth. Now, I'm of the mind, and I think this can be readily defended, that truth is just simply truth. Fact is simply fact. Your perception of what the truth is your perception. I've discussed this before in a previous podcast, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it here, but your perception of what the truth is does not determine what the truth is. Okay? And while your perception certainly may be valid for whatever purposes you may have, whether it influences how you vote or how you live your life, sure, it's valid in that sense. But simply being a perception does not make something a fact. And you can say that for any side of the political spectrum. You can say that about anyone. It goes for anyone, right? Whether the objective truth stands to bolster my point or the other side's point doesn't matter. If the objective truth is the objective truth, my perception, your perception, might play a role in a discussion, a debate, how we view the world. Sure, that's where the validity of a perception is, but it doesn't determine what is a fact.